The year was 1943, and across the battlefields of Europe, something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in modern warfare, women were putting on military uniforms and stepping into roles that had been reserved exclusively for men for centuries. They flew fighter planes through hostile skies, operated radios behind enemy lines, and carried weapons in resistance movements across occupied territory. These women believed they were protected by the same rules of war that had governed military conduct for generations. They were tragically mistaken. What awaited captured female soldiers in German hands was a nightmare that military strategists had never anticipated and that governments would spend decades trying to hide. The systematic brutality unleashed upon these women went far beyond conventional prisoner treatment, revealing a darkness that challenged everything the civilized world thought it knew about warfare and human decency. Today, we're going to expose the horrifying truth about what happened to female military prisoners during World War II, a story that remained buried in classified files for over half a century. The evidence we're about to examine comes from recently declassified documents, survivor testimonies that were sealed for decades, and German military records discovered long after the war ended. These sources paint a picture so disturbing that Allied governments immediately classified the information upon discovery, deciding that some truths were too dangerous for public consumption. But the women who endured these horrors deserve to have their stories told, no matter how uncomfortable those stories might make us today. Picture this scene repeating across multiple theaters of war. American Women's Army Corps officers captured during German breakthrough operations in Italy. British air transport auxiliary pilots shot down while delivering aircraft to forward airfields. French resistance operatives caught during sabotage missions behind enemy lines. Each time these women fell into German hands, they faced a reception unlike anything their male counterparts would experience. The moment of capture revealed the first hint that something was fundamentally different about how female prisoners would be treated. German officers seemed genuinely surprised to encounter women in military uniforms, but that surprise quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Contemporary accounts describe German captors examining female prisoners with expressions that went beyond military assessment, displaying a mixture of curiosity, disdain, and something that can only be described as predatory interest. The Geneva Convention was clear about prisoner treatment, establishing specific protections for captured military personnel regardless of their nationality or role. These international agreements had been crafted to maintain some semblance of civilized conduct even in the midst of total war. Female prisoners knew their rights under these conventions and initially attempted to invoke them when captured. What they discovered was that German high command had developed an entirely different interpretation of these protections when it came to women who had dared to take up arms. German military leadership viewed female combatants through the lens of Nazi ideology about proper gender roles. In their twisted worldview, women who took military positions had abandoned their natural feminine state and forfeited the protections normally afforded to their sex. This wasn't the opinion of a few rogue officers acting independently, but official policy developed at the highest levels of German command and implemented systematically across all occupied territories. The documentation of this policy makes for chilling reading. Internal German memos, discovered decades after the war, revealed detailed planning sessions where Nazi officials discussed how to handle what they termed the aberration of female soldiers. These weren't hastily written battlefield orders, but carefully crafted protocols that reflected months of discussion and planning. The Germans had been anticipating the capture of Allied women soldiers and had prepared specific procedures designed to exploit what they perceived as uniquely female vulnerabilities. The classification system the Germans developed for female prisoners differed fundamentally from standard prisoner processing. While male captives were sorted by rank, nationality, and military specialty, women faced an additional layer of categorization based on what German officers called moral compromise. The very act of taking military service was viewed as evidence that these women had abandoned proper feminine behavior, making them subject to treatment that would never be applied to conventional prisoners. This specialized classification system created a shadow network of detention facilities specifically designed for female prisoners. These installations didn't appear on standard military maps, weren't subject to Red Cross inspections, and operated according to rules that existed nowhere in official German military doctrine. The secrecy surrounding these facilities was so complete that many didn't appear in any records discovered by Allied forces during the initial liberation of German territory. The transportation process itself became the first stage of systematic dehumanization. While male prisoners were typically moved in standard military transports with other captives, women were segregated immediately upon capture and moved separately through routes that avoided established prisoner processing centers. This separation wasn't just logistical, it was psychological warfare designed to isolate these women from any witnesses who might later testify about their treatment. The journey to these specialized facilities often took days, during which captured women were given minimal food and water while being transported in vehicles without proper sanitation or heating. German guards used this time to begin the process of breaking down their prisoners' sense of identity as soldiers, repeatedly emphasizing their vulnerability as women in enemy hands and describing in graphic detail what awaited them at their destination. Upon arrival at these secret facilities, female prisoners encountered their first formal introduction to what German documentation called enhanced processing protocols. The term was deliberately euphemistic, designed to obscure the true nature of procedures that violated every principle of military prisoner treatment established by international law. These protocols had been developed through what German records describe as extensive research into the psychological vulnerabilities of Western women who had abandoned traditional gender roles. The initial processing phase involved complete strip searches conducted not for security purposes, but as a deliberate form of humiliation designed to establish the powerlessness of these former soldiers. Unlike standard prisoner searches, these examinations were conducted in front of multiple German officers of both sexes, with cameras present to document the proceedings. The photographs taken during these sessions weren't filed as identification records, but were later discovered in the personal collections of camp commanders, revealing their true purpose as trophies rather than administrative documentation. German medical personnel participated in examinations that went far beyond anything justified by health concerns or security requirements. These procedures were designed to emphasize the physical vulnerability of female prisoners, while collecting what German records term research data about the physiological and psychological responses of women soldiers to stress and humiliation. The clinical language used in German documentation couldn't disguise the fact that these were torture sessions, disguised as medical examinations. The clothing issued to female prisoners after processing differed significantly from standard prisoner uniforms. Instead of practical military-style garments, women received civilian dresses that were often too small or too revealing, with inadequate undergarments and shoes that provided little protection against cold or rough surfaces. This wasn't simple neglect, but a calculated decision designed to constantly remind these women of their vulnerability and their loss of military status. The psychological impact of these initial procedures was immediate and severe. Women who had trained as soldiers, who had served alongside male colleagues as equals, suddenly found themselves treated not as captured military personnel, but as objects of curiosity and derision. The systematic nature of this treatment made it clear that every aspect had been carefully planned to achieve maximum psychological damage while maintaining the veneer of official military procedure. What made this treatment particularly devastating was its official sanction at the highest levels of German command. This wasn't the result of undisciplined soldiers acting without orders, but the implementation of policies that had been debated, refined, and approved through normal German military channels. The women subjected to these procedures quickly realized they weren't just fighting individual sadists. but confronting an entire system designed to destroy their sense of identity as soldiers and reduce them to something less than human. The German approach to female prisoners revealed a calculated understanding of psychological warfare that went far beyond conventional military thinking. They had studied their enemies, not just as soldiers, but as women from specific cultural backgrounds, developing techniques specifically designed to exploit Western concepts of feminine dignity and honor. This research-based approach to brutality represented a new low in the systematic application of cruelty as a weapon of war. As we delve deeper into this dark chapter of history, the evidence becomes increasingly difficult to confront. But understanding what happened to these women is essential not just for historical accuracy, but for ensuring that such systematic abuse of prisoners can never again be hidden behind classifications and official silence. The systematic breakdown of female military prisoners didn't end with initial processing. German commanders had developed what their own documentation called Phase 2 protocols, procedures that would push captured women beyond the breaking point through methods that male prisoners would never experience. These techniques were refined through what Nazi officials termed scientific observation, treating human suffering as data points in their grotesque research into feminine psychology under extreme duress. The interrogation methods employed against female prisoners represented a departure from conventional military questioning. While male captives faced standard techniques focused on extracting tactical information, women encountered something far more sinister. German intelligence officers had developed specialized approaches that targeted what they believed were uniquely feminine vulnerabilities, using threats and actions that went far beyond anything sanctioned by military protocol or international law. The physical environment of these interrogation sessions was carefully designed to maximize psychological impact. Unlike standard questioning rooms equipped with basic furniture and recording equipment, the spaces used for female prisoners resembled private quarters more than official facilities. German officers understood that removing the formal military atmosphere would make their victims feel more vulnerable and isolated from their identity as soldiers. Multiple German officers would typically be present during these sessions, creating an atmosphere of overwhelming male dominance that was intended to remind female prisoners of their physical vulnerability. The questioning itself often focused less on military intelligence than on personal details about the women's backgrounds, their motivations for joining the military, and intimate aspects of their lives that had no bearing on legitimate intelligence gathering. German female guards played a particularly cruel role in this systematic abuse. These women, selected and trained specifically for their willingness to participate in the brutalization of female prisoners, often displayed more viciousness than their male counterparts. They viewed captured Allied women as traitors to their entire gender, believing that by abandoning traditional feminine roles, these prisoners had forfeited any claim to sisterly protection or mercy. The nighttime hours brought the worst horrors for captured women. German records euphemistically refer to evening questioning sessions, but surviving testimony reveals these were opportunities for abuse that went far beyond interrogation. Officers would conduct what they called private consultations with female prisoners, sessions that took place away from official observation and left no formal documentation beyond clinical notes about prisoner cooperation levels. The medical experimentation conducted on female prisoners represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their captivity. German physicians, operating under the guise of research into the physiological differences between male and female soldiers, subjected women to procedures that served no legitimate medical or intelligence purpose. These experiments were designed to study pain tolerance, psychological breaking points, and what German documentation termed the limits of feminine endurance. The Germans maintained meticulous records of their experiments, rating each technique for effectiveness and noting which approaches produced the desired results most efficiently. They conducted comparative studies between women of different nationalities, testing whether American, British, or French prisoners responded differently to various forms of abuse. This clinical approach to torture revealed a level of systematic cruelty that shocked even hardened military investigators when the documentation was finally discovered. Female prisoners were often forced to choose between their own suffering and watching other women endure worse treatment. German guards would bring younger prisoners before older ones, threatening escalated abuse unless the senior women provided information or cooperation. These impossible choices were designed to break down the solidarity that naturally developed between women facing shared horror, turning victims against each other in desperate attempts to protect those they cared about. The psychological manipulation extended to every aspect of daily life in these facilities. Women were kept on irregular schedules that disrupted their sense of time and normalcy. Meals were provided at random intervals, often consisting of food that had been deliberately contaminated or prepared in ways designed to disgust rather than nourish. Sleep deprivation became a constant weapon, with guards conducting random inspections and searches throughout the night. The clothing restrictions imposed on female prisoners served multiple purposes beyond simple humiliation. The inadequate garments made escape attempts nearly impossible, while constantly reminding the women of their vulnerability. German guards would frequently comment on their prisoners' appearance, making degrading observations designed to reduce these former soldiers to objects of ridicule and contempt. Communication between prisoners was severely restricted through isolation techniques that male captives rarely faced. Women were kept in smaller groups and moved frequently between different sections of the facilities to prevent the formation of strong bonds or organized resistance. When they were allowed to interact, conversations were monitored constantly by guards who had been trained to identify signs of military solidarity or escape planning. The spiritual and emotional support that sustained many male prisoners was systematically attacked in female facilities. German commanders understood that women often drew strength from religious faith or memories of family. So these sources of comfort became targets for deliberate destruction. Religious items were confiscated and destroyed in front of their owners, while guards would provide false information about the deaths or suffering of prisoners' families back home. The long-term psychological damage inflicted on female prisoners was carefully documented by German medical staff, who viewed their suffering as valuable research data. They tracked the progression of what they called adjustment to feminine status, noting how long it took for former soldiers to abandon their military bearing and identity. These observations were recorded in clinical language that masked the horror of watching strong women systematically broken down by calculated cruelty. Some women managed to maintain forms of resistance even under these extreme conditions. They would whisper military codes and procedures to each other when guards weren't listening, maintaining their connection to their soldier identity through small acts of defiance. Others found ways to support each other emotionally, sharing what little food they received or providing comfort to those who had endured the worst treatment during interrogation sessions. The German response to this resistance was swift and brutal. Women caught supporting each other faced immediate punishment designed to discourage similar behavior from others. The guards would isolate resistant prisoners for extended periods, subjecting them to intensified abuse while making sure other women could hear their suffering. These demonstrations were intended to break down the solidarity that allowed female prisoners to maintain their humanity and hope. As the war progressed and German resources became strained, the treatment of female prisoners grew even worse. Facilities that had maintained some pretense of medical or intelligence-gathering purposes devolved into sites of pure brutality designed to satisfy the sadistic impulses of guards who knew the war was lost. The systematic nature of the abuse gave way to random violence that served no purpose beyond the infliction of suffering. The documentation of these horrors was preserved in German files that would remain hidden for decades after the war ended. The clinical language used to describe torture techniques and experimental procedures provided chilling evidence of how ordinary military personnel could be transformed into instruments of systematic cruelty through ideological indoctrination and official sanction. The discovery of these facilities by advancing Allied forces in 1945 marked the beginning of another tragedy, one that would compound the suffering these women had already endured. Liberation should have meant vindication, recognition, and justice. Instead, it brought a different kind of betrayal that would silence their voices for generations. The young soldiers who broke down the doors of these secret installations were unprepared for what they found inside. Hardened combat veterans who had witnessed the horrors of concentration camps found themselves shaken by the condition of the female prisoners they discovered. The physical state of these women told a story that military manuals had never prepared anyone to handle. Severely malnourished, bearing injuries that defied medical explanation, many couldn't speak coherently about their experiences. Others spoke too much, words tumbling out in desperate torrents as they tried to make their liberators understand what had been done to them. The psychological damage was immediately apparent, manifesting in behaviors that confused and disturbed the soldiers attempting to provide aid. Within hours of liberation, military intelligence officers arrived at these facilities with orders that would shape how these women's stories would be handled for decades to come. The initial reports filed by liberating forces were quickly classified at levels higher than most battlefield intelligence. Medical personnel were instructed to treat the physical symptoms they observed while avoiding detailed documentation of their causes. Photographers who had documented other prisoner camps were notably absent from these particular liberation sites. The segregation that had begun with capture continued even after rescue. While male prisoners of war were processed through established repatriation centers with full media coverage and public celebration, female survivors found themselves quietly transferred to specialized medical facilities away from public view. The debriefing process they underwent bore little resemblance to standard prisoner interviews, focusing instead on extracting every detail of their experiences while simultaneously ensuring their silence about what they had endured. Military psychiatrists assigned to evaluate these women faced a unique challenge. The symptoms they observed didn't fit existing categories for combat stress or prisoner trauma. The combination of physical and psychological damage created conditions that medical science of the era struggled to understand or treat. Rather than developing new approaches to help these victims, the military medical establishment chose to classify their conditions as sensitive information, requiring specialized handling away from conventional medical channels. The legal implications of what had been discovered posed enormous problems for Allied leadership. The systematic nature of the abuse, documented in captured German files, revealed war crimes of a scope and specificity that challenged existing frameworks for military justice. The evidence was so damning that some officials worried about its impact on post-war relations with Germany and the broader effort to rebuild European stability. The decision was made to pursue selected prosecutions while keeping the most disturbing evidence sealed indefinitely. Intelligence officers conducting debriefings with female survivors found themselves gathering testimony that no military court was prepared to hear. The systematic sexual violence, medical experimentation, and psychological torture described by these women went beyond anything addressed in existing war crimes legislation. The detailed German documentation of these procedures created an uncomfortable legal precedent that prosecutors worried might complicate other cases if made public. The women themselves quickly discovered that their own governments viewed them as problems to be managed rather than heroes to be celebrated. Official policy treated their experiences as security risks that could damage public morale and complicate diplomatic relations. They were required to sign agreements promising never to discuss specific aspects of their captivity, with violations potentially resulting in prosecution for revealing classified information. These silencing orders were presented as necessary for national security, but served primarily to protect institutions from uncomfortable questions. Medical treatment for survivors reflected the official desire to make these women's problems disappear rather than address their root causes. Doctors prescribed sedatives and recommended rest while avoiding detailed examination of the trauma that caused their symptoms. When women attempted to describe what had happened to them, medical personnel often interrupted or redirected conversations toward more conventional topics. The message was clear that recovery meant forgetting, not processing their experiences. The families of these women faced their own challenges in understanding what their loved ones had endured. Official notifications about their service and captivity contained vague language about difficult conditions, without any specifics about the nature of their treatment. When survivors returned home, they found relatives who expected normal readjustment difficulties, not the complex trauma responses that actually characterized their condition. The gap between expectation and reality created additional isolation for women who desperately needed support. Public recognition of women's military service during the war focused deliberately on positive stories that reinforced traditional gender roles, while avoiding acknowledgement of the darker realities some had faced. Media coverage celebrated women who had served their countries while maintaining feminine virtues, implicitly suggesting that those who had experienced severe trauma had somehow failed to measure up to this ideal. The contrast between public celebration of women's service and private silence about their suffering created a painful contradiction for survivors. The psychological impact of official silencing proved as damaging as the original trauma in many cases. Women who had survived systematic abuse through maintaining their identity as soldiers found themselves told to forget that identity entirely. The courage and resistance that had sustained them through captivity became sources of shame that they were instructed to suppress. This secondary trauma, inflicted by their own governments, compounded the damage done by their captors. Academic and historical research into women's military service during the war carefully avoided the subject of prisoner treatment for decades after the conflict ended. Scholars who discovered references to specialized enemy procedures for female captives found their access to relevant documents blocked by classification systems that seemed designed to prevent investigation rather than protect legitimate security interests. The few researchers who persisted in their inquiries often found their careers damaged by associations with sensitive topics. Veterans organizations and support groups established for former prisoners of war typically excluded or marginalized women whose experiences didn't fit standard narratives about military captivity. The assumption that female prisoners had faced the same challenges as their male counterparts, just with additional inconveniences, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what these women had actually endured. Support systems designed around male experiences proved inadequate for addressing the specific trauma patterns that characterized female survivors. The international legal community struggled with the implications of evidence about systematic abuse of female prisoners. The detailed documentation discovered in German archives revealed planning and implementation of torture techniques specifically designed to exploit gender-based vulnerabilities, challenging existing frameworks for understanding war crimes. Rather than expanding legal definitions to address these realities, the decision was made to handle such cases through existing categories that failed to capture their unique characteristics. Diplomatic considerations played a major role in decisions about how to handle evidence of systematic abuse. Allied governments worried that detailed revelations about the treatment of female prisoners might complicate efforts to rebuild relationships with former enemies, or create expectations for similar disclosures about their own military practices. The preference for stability over justice shaped policies that prioritized institutional interests over individual accountability for documented crimes. The technological limitations of the era provided convenient excuses for the destruction or loss of evidence that might have supported fuller prosecution of war crimes against female prisoners. Photographic and audio documentation that survived liberation was often declared too damaged or incomplete for legal use, while written records disappeared into classification systems that made retrieval nearly impossible. The systematic elimination of evidence served to protect institutions while abandoning the women whose suffering that evidence documented. Religious and social organizations that might have provided support for trauma survivors were often unprepared to handle the specific challenges faced by former female prisoners. The combination of military service and captivity trauma created conditions that challenged conventional approaches to pastoral care and social support. Many women found themselves isolated from traditional support networks that couldn't accommodate their experiences or needs. Medical research into trauma treatment made little progress in addressing the conditions observed in female prisoner survivors, partly because the patient population was kept hidden from researchers who might have developed effective interventions. The classification of their symptoms as security-sensitive information prevented the kind of systematic study that could have improved treatment options. This deliberate obstruction of medical progress served bureaucratic interests while prolonging the suffering of women who needed help. The personal relationships of female survivors often suffered from the combination of trauma symptoms and official pressure to maintain silence about their experiences. Marriages strained under the weight of unspoken horrors, while friendships founded on the inability to share fundamental experiences that had shaped their worldview. The isolation imposed by classification requirements created additional barriers to recovery that compounded the original damage. As years passed, and the immediate post-war period gave way to Cold War concerns, the priority given to maintaining official silence about female prisoner experiences only intensified. New security considerations made any discussion of systematic enemy brutality potentially useful to propaganda efforts by emerging adversaries. The women whose suffering had been documented in such clinical detail found themselves trapped in a web of secrecy that served everyone's interests except their own. The decades that followed the war's end witnessed a systematic campaign of historical erasure that would prove as devastating to these women as their original captivity. Intelligence agencies across the Allied nations coordinated efforts to ensure that specific details about the treatment of female prisoners would never reach public consciousness. This wasn't merely bureaucratic caution, but active suppression of evidence that challenged comfortable narratives about civilized warfare and military honor. The destruction of evidence began almost immediately after liberation. German documents that detailed the specialized procedures for female prisoners were either destroyed entirely or transferred to classified archives that researchers couldn't access for decades. Allied military personnel who had witnessed the condition of liberated women were reassigned to distant postings and instructed never to discuss what they had observed. The systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence created an information void that would persist for generations. Female survivors who attempted to seek justice through official channels found themselves confronting a wall of institutional resistance. Military legal officers claimed that existing evidence was insufficient for prosecution, despite the existence of detailed German records documenting systematic abuse. When women pressed for explanations, they were told that pursuing such cases would compromise ongoing intelligence operations or damage relationships with reformed German institutions. The message was clear that their suffering mattered less than political convenience. The psychological warfare that had begun in German captivity continued under Allied supervision through different means. Instead of physical torture, survivors faced administrative torture designed to exhaust their will to seek recognition or justice. They were shuffled between different agencies, each claiming that another department handled their particular type of case. Paperwork disappeared, appointments were cancelled without explanation, and officials claimed no knowledge of previous conversations or commitments. Medical professionals who treated these women often became unwitting participants in the cover-up by accepting official explanations that minimized the severity of their patients' conditions. Doctors were told that detailed questioning about trauma sources could impede recovery, effectively preventing them from understanding or properly treating the complex symptoms they observed. This medical gaslighting convinced many survivors that their memories or perceptions of their experiences were somehow flawed or exaggerated. The families of female survivors found themselves drawn into the conspiracy of silence through social pressure and official intimidation. Relatives who asked too many questions about their loved ones' wartime experiences received visits from military personnel who explained the importance of not dwelling on unpleasant memories. Communities that might have supported returning veterans were given sanitized versions of women's service that omitted any mention of the brutal realities some had faced. Educational institutions played their part in the erasure by producing historical accounts of the war that treated women's military service as a footnote to more important male achievements. When female prisoners were mentioned at all, their experiences were described in vague terms that suggested temporary hardship rather than systematic torture. Academic historians who discovered evidence of more severe treatment found their access to source materials blocked by classification systems that seemed designed to prevent investigation. The entertainment industry contributed to the historical distortion by producing films and books about wartime experiences that portrayed female military personnel in ways that reinforced traditional gender stereotypes while avoiding acknowledgement of the darker realities some had faced. These popular culture representations created false expectations about women's wartime experiences that made it even harder for survivors to discuss what had actually happened to them. International organizations that might have investigated war crimes against female prisoners were systematically denied access to relevant evidence. The Red Cross and other humanitarian groups were told that such investigations would interfere with ongoing legal proceedings that never materialized. When international pressure mounted for disclosure of war crimes evidence, officials released carefully edited documents that revealed general patterns of abuse while concealing the most damaging specifics about systematic targeting of women. The few journalists who attempted to investigate stories about female prisoner treatment found themselves facing professional obstacles that effectively ended their careers. Editors refused to publish articles based on classified information, while sources suddenly became unavailable when contacted for follow-up interviews. The message to the media establishment was clear that certain subjects remained off-limits, regardless of their historical significance or human interest value. Veterans organizations that should have advocated for all former prisoners instead reinforced the marginalization of female survivors by treating their experiences as fundamentally different from legitimate military service. Women who attempted to participate in prisoner support groups were often told that their cases didn't qualify for the same benefits or recognition accorded to male veterans. This institutional discrimination compounded the isolation these women faced while struggling to rebuild their lives. Religious institutions that provided comfort to other war survivors often proved inadequate for addressing the specific spiritual challenges faced by female former prisoners. Clergy who offered counseling typically lacked understanding of the complex trauma these women had endured, while religious communities sometimes viewed their military service with suspicion rather than respect. The combination of theological inadequacy and social judgment left many survivors without traditional sources of spiritual support. The legal profession failed these women through a combination of ignorance and institutional cowardice. Attorneys who might have pursued civil remedies for war crimes were discouraged by the classification of relevant evidence and the government's obvious reluctance to support such cases. The few lawyers who persisted in representing female survivors found themselves obstructed by procedural barriers that seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate justice. Medical research institutions that could have studied the unique trauma patterns observed in female prisoner survivors were denied access to potential subjects through classification requirements that treated their conditions as state secrets. This obstruction of scientific inquiry prevented the development of treatment approaches that might have helped not only these specific women, but future victims of similar systematic abuse. The prioritization of secrecy over medical progress represented a betrayal of scientific principles that compounded the original crimes. Social service agencies tasked with helping veterans readjust to civilian life proved unprepared for the complex challenges faced by female former prisoners. Caseworkers trained to address standard combat stress reactions couldn't understand or effectively treat the symptoms displayed by women who had endured systematic psychological and physical torture. The inadequacy of available support systems left many survivors struggling alone with conditions that existing services couldn't address. The economic consequences of official neglect proved as devastating as the psychological damage for many female survivors. Women whose health had been permanently damaged by their captivity experiences found themselves unable to work while being denied the disability benefits accorded to other veterans with service-related injuries. The bureaucratic barriers erected around their cases effectively prevented them from accessing compensation that might have provided some measure of security during their recovery. Labor unions and professional organizations that might have advocated for these women instead often viewed them with suspicion or discomfort. The combination of their gender and their wartime experiences created a category that didn't fit established frameworks for veteran support. Many survivors found themselves excluded from professional networks and advancement opportunities because their backgrounds made colleagues uncomfortable, or because officials worried about security implications. Educational opportunities that were extended to male veterans through government programs remained largely inaccessible to female survivors whose cases were entangled in classification requirements. Women who sought to use educational benefits found themselves facing additional scrutiny and restrictions that effectively prevented them from taking advantage of programs designed to help veterans rebuild their lives. This educational discrimination limited their ability to develop new careers that might have provided both income and purpose. The isolation experienced by female survivors was reinforced by the geographic dispersion that resulted from official policies designed to prevent them from comparing experiences or organizing collective action. Women who had shared captivity were deliberately separated during repatriation and sent to different regions where they couldn't maintain contact with others who might validate their memories or support their efforts to seek recognition. Housing assistance programs that helped other veterans establish stable living situations often excluded or marginalized female survivors whose cases were considered too sensitive for standard processing. The additional screening requirements and restrictions imposed on these women made it difficult for them to access basic services, while adding another layer of bureaucratic humiliation to their post-war experiences. Mental health services that might have provided crucial support were systematically denied to female survivors through policies that treated their conditions as security risks rather than medical needs. Women who sought psychiatric help were often told that discussing their experiences could violate classification requirements, effectively preventing them from receiving the treatment they desperately needed. This cruel paradox trapped survivors between their need for help and official demands for silence. The technological limitations of the era provided convenient excuses for the loss or destruction of evidence that might have supported these women's claims for recognition or compensation. Documents disappeared from files, photographs became mysteriously unavailable, and recording equipment malfunctioned during crucial testimonies. The systematic nature of these technical failures suggested deliberate sabotage rather than accidental loss. International diplomatic considerations continued to shape policies toward female prisoner survivors long after the immediate post-war period ended. Officials worried that acknowledging the full scope of systematic abuse might complicate relationships with NATO allies or provide propaganda opportunities for Cold War adversaries. The women whose suffering had been so meticulously documented found themselves sacrificed to geopolitical calculations that valued stability over justice. The few survivors who managed to maintain some public voice about their experiences faced continued harassment designed to discredit their credibility or exhaust their resources. Private investigators followed them. Employers received mysterious calls questioning their reliability, and medical professionals suddenly became unavailable when they sought treatment. This systematic intimidation campaign served to silence even the most determined advocates for recognition and justice. As the original generation of officials responsible for the cover-up retired or died, their replacements inherited policies and classification systems that had become institutionalized beyond any individual's ability to change. The bureaucratic momentum of secrecy became self-perpetuating, with each new generation of administrators assuming that existing restrictions must serve important purposes even if those purposes were no longer clear or relevant. The psychological toll of decades of official denial proved as damaging as the original trauma for many survivors. Women who had maintained hope for eventual recognition or justice gradually succumbed to despair as they realized that their governments had no intention of acknowledging what had been done to them. The betrayal by institutions they had served created wounds that never healed, transforming heroes into forgotten victims of a conspiracy that outlasted most of its original architects. The silence has persisted for over 8 decades now, but the truth can no longer be contained within the classified vaults where it was buried. These women, who volunteered to serve their nations with the same courage as their male counterparts, deserved far better than the systematic brutality they endured and the deliberate erasure that followed. Their stories reveal not just the depths of human cruelty, but the equally disturbing willingness of civilized governments to sacrifice individual justice for institutional convenience. We owe these forgotten heroes more than mere acknowledgement. We owe them the promise that such betrayals will never again be hidden behind the comfortable lies of official secrecy.